Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC stream session, The Problem of Public Exhibition. Understanding the Cinematograph Act and the proposed amendments. With India's track record with media and press freedom plummeting, the latest amendments proposed to the Cinematograph Act 1952 has been cause for concern amongst filmmakers regarding the autonomy of the media of film and its censorship by the government. The amendments propose changes the threat that threaten to take away the autonomy of the CBFC and filmmakers. This comes in close succession with the abolishment of the Film Certificate Appellate Tribunal in April 2021. In addition to providing a basic context and a 101 to understanding the issue and providing illustrative examples, the panel, consisting of film practitioners Anand Patwardhan, Vijay, Krishna, Acharya, Archana, Padmini, and academic and scholar Lawrence Liang, will attempt to respond to questions like what are the implications of the proposed amendment and the abolishment of the FCAT? Do the proposed amendments override due process as it exists within the certification process? Do the proposed amendments allow the government to supersede an expert committee performing quasi-judicial functions? And do the proposed amendments potentially violate the Constitution? The full bios of the speakers will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you, the audience, have any questions, observations, or comments to share, please feel free to use the Q&A box that is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, over to Lawrence.
Thanks, Lekha. And welcome all of you to this discussion on the proposed amendment to the Cinematograph Act. We have with us today 4 speakers. We have Anand Patwardhan, Archana Padmini, Sumana Kitur may or may not join us. And finally, we have Vijay Krishna Acharya. And we'll go in that order. But before I hand it over to the speakers, what I wanted to do was to kind of lay out the background and provide a bit of a context for those unfamiliar with what these proposed amendments are and why we should be concerned about them. So the first thing to note is that there is something kind of peculiar about the censorship of cinema, as opposed to, for example, the censorship of, let's say, novels, etc., in India. And what's the difference between the two? The difference is simply this. In the case of a novel, you can write a novel without needing anyone's permission. Subsequent to your publishing the novel, of course, people may complain or file a police complaint against you, etc., and then you defend yourself, constitutionally, whether on grounds of obscenity or sedition, etc. This is basically what is known as post-censorship. So you don't need any permission for anyone to actually write the novel and to circulate the novel, right? The case of cinema is slightly different because the case of cinema is governed by what is known as pre-censorship, which is that even before you actually exhibit any film, you have to have the permission of the government in the form of the censor certificate granted by the CBFC, which is the Central Board for Film Certification. So unlike the case of a novel, you actually need authorization before the novel is actually, before the film is actually exhibited, right? Now there's something curious because it has great implications for the proposed amendment. Now, in 1965, the famous, filmmaker, writer K. Abbas actually kind of, filed a constitutional challenge against the distinction made between cinema and other media in what is now known as K. Abbas versus Union of India. And he challenged the constitutional validity of provisions of the Cinematograph Act. The court in this instance upheld the validity of the act, but on grounds which today is something that we're not going to be discussing, but really on a somewhat kind of, let's say early media distinction between cinema and other forms. So the argument was that cinema has a much more vivid impact. Cinema's realism is different from that of the novel, etc. A lot of the arguments that we're familiar with and which have been debunked in a way by media kind of, studies, but we're not interested in that today. But as a part of their observations, what the court did hold was this. They said that while we are upholding the overall validity of the Cinematograph Act, what we want to point out is that there should be a distinction between an expert tribunal or a body performing in a way a judicial or a quasi-judicial kind of act in terms of determining an appeal that comes from let's say the Board of Film Censors. And it should not be, to the government that this appeal is made. So if a filmmaker, if a filmmaker is dissatisfied with cuts that have been demanded by the board, the appeal should really go to a tribunal or to a court, right? So this is the observations that they made. And subsequent to the case and an undertaking given by the government, the appellate tribunal was established under the Cinematograph Act. That's the broad kind of the background. But again, something curious happens. So even as the government, in principle, is establishing an appellate tribunal, they also introduce Section 6 of 1 of the Cinematograph Act, which basically allows them wide kind of powers to basically retain for themselves the revisioning power of the government, right? And basically what happens with this is that it provides the powers to the government to supersede any proceeding which is taking place before the board or the appellate tribunal. That's the background. Why is this background important to us? In 1990, a filmmaker from Karnataka, in a case called K.M. Shankarappa versus Union of India, challenges all over again various provisions of the Cinematograph Act and the constitutional validity of these provisions. In this particular instance, the Karnataka High Court in the first instance upholds again the validity of all of the provisions except one, Section 6.1, or the revisioning power of the government. And they basically argue that Section 6.1 is an absolute violation of the Constitution. They go so far as to describing it as a travesty of law, because one of the basic structures of the Constitution is the separation of powers. And the separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial powers is violated or breached because of the fact that here, effectively, the government retains for itself judicial power. So even after a tribunal and after an appellate body has certified the film, the government can effectively overrule or kind of supersede that decision. This High Court judgment was upheld again by the Supreme Court in 2001, which basically kind of affirmed all of the reasons that were given. Right, that's the kind of the background. And Section 6.1 of the Cinematograph Act was therefore held to be unconstitutional and no longer on the books. The story of this is basically what leads us now to the contemporary situation. There are two major things that happened. In April 2021, there was the abolishment of the appellate tribunal, and in July 2021, there was a proposed amendment, June 2021, I'm sorry, proposed amendment to the Cinematograph Act that was mooted. What does the amendment propose? The amendment basically, even while it removes Section 6.1 because of the directive of the Supreme Court, asks for the inclusion of a provision that retains effectively what used to be there in Section 6.1. And that's really the heart of today's kind of debate, right? So this is the kind of the quick overall background. What I would like to do is hand it over to the panel to look at the consequences of this. But one last factoid before doing it, because I can't help but notice that we are in 2021. Almost 100 years since the establishment of the famous Indian Cinematograph Committee in 1925. The Indian Cinematograph Committee, which forms in a way the background to the censorship of cinema in India, was constituted because the British were extremely concerned about the inability of native Indians to kind of read images, right? They felt that a lot of what was being portrayed in terms of sex and violence coming in from Hollywood would basically tarnish the might and the honor of the empire. So as all colonial problems go, the moment a problem was created or identified, a committee was formed, a high-level committee that basically examined witnesses from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Kabul to Rangoon, interviewing a range of people from Gandhi to the common man and much of the doyens of silent cinema. But amongst the various people, the one person that they also interviewed was Lala Lajpat Rai. And Lala Lajpat Rai was called before the ICC, and he was told, and he was said that, and he was informed that there was a need for censorship of cinema in India because Indian audiences were not ready. Right? There was an infantilizing in a way of the Indian audience. Lala Lajpat Rai replied to the committee and said that I don't want the future citizens of India growing up in a nursery. I want them to grow up exposed both to good and bad, and to make up their own minds about what it is that they want to watch. And this is the only manner in which we can guarantee a mature future citizen of the country. This happened in 1925 or 1926. In 2021, we are back to the drawing board, where we are asking the question of whether or not citizens of 2021 in India are mature enough to distinguish between images that can be bad or good for them, etc. So with this, I'll hand it over to the panel, and if there are particular aspects which are of a technical nature, we can come back to that in the Q&A. So let me begin with Anand. Anand, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for your introduction, which was very good, because I hadn't actually read this new proposed act in detail. All I know is probably the worst aspects of it, and for me the most scary aspect is that they propose now to attribute to themselves the right of recall. That means films that have already been given a censor certificate in the past, probably by previous governments, most likely, or sometimes even by this government, because occasionally a film gets through even in these circumstances. But in the past, we fought for and we won our censor certificates. I know in my case, almost every film has gone through the process and finally emerged without cuts. And I must say that I have worn that censor certificate as a kind of a shield against those who tried to stop the screenings of my films. So, and this happened as recently as 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, when Ram Ke Naam, which has got a U censor certificate, was stopped in 5 different colleges all over the country. But because the film has a certificate, the students who were trying to show the film in their colleges could actually call on the police and say, it's these disruptors that are trying to stop the screening, and we have a right to show the film. And the screenings went ahead. Now the government is saying that they have the power to recall these censor certificates because of some complaint. And how difficult is it for the government of today to find a bunch of RSS or any like-minded goons to write in saying they don't like the politics of a certain film, or they don't find it sanskari enough for them, for their taste, and then the government can use this as an excuse to withdraw the certificate. And then I think the government, this proposal, correct me if I'm wrong, also proposes that the certificate that they issue, that will be sacrosanct. That will never be removed again. It will be forever. So on the one hand, they're saying that they can remove any certificate granted in the past. And then they're saying that the certificates that they grant will last forever. So it makes no sense at all. And it's definitely frightening to think that certificates can now be removed. Of course, there are many of us many filmmakers who don't go through the process of censorship at all and still show their films, and you can get away with that to a certain extent. But of course, it puts into problems the people who are trying to show your films, because if it has no certificate, they can legitimately stop the screening, even confiscate the equipment. So this new part of the proposal is something abominable and has to be opposed. I haven't got enough details to talk about the other sections in the act. Of course, the other thing we should talk about is the dastardly way in which the FCAT was removed, the Appellate Tribunal, because that was the last stage of staying within the censorship rules. And I've used that stage many times, because many of my films at the censorship stage, went to revising committee after revising committee, and finally ended up with the appellate tribunal, where we won our battles, and the appellate tribunal said it could pass without that it should be issued a certificate without any cuts. In the few cases where the appellate tribunal also failed, then I went to an actual court, and we won in court. So with War and Peace, for instance, we actually went to court, to the High Court, and the High Court ruled that the film had to be given a U certificate without any cuts. So anyway, I think that's the crux of my opposition to what is going on right now. Of course, there were attempts by, for instance, the Sham Benegal Committee that we hoped would liberalize the process of censorship, because we were arguing that, in fact, documentary films should not be seen as something they can cut, because after all, television shows you the news and shows you views without any censorship, and documentaries are not that different. They're talking about real life events and recording real life events, and so they should, if TV can be shown without censorship, so should documentaries be allowed. So I think I will leave it at that and take questions as they come.
Thanks, Anand. Anand has raised a very, very important point, which is also reflected in the history of the Cinematograph Act, which is that we normally think of the entire process of censorship and the obtainment of the censor certificate as necessarily as a repressive act. But Anand has pointed out how the certificate can also be a very productive tool to have to claim protection from the state in the case of any threats, but also as a protection against legal action. So if you recall the famous Satyam Shivam Sundaram film by Raj Kapoor, subsequent to the release of the film, obscenity complaints were filed against Raj Kapoor. But Raj Kapoor's defense, upheld by the courts, was the fact that this was a film that had a censor certificate, which means that it was given an adult certificate, and the censor board had cleared it to be watched by a particular audience. So in that case, again, like Anand has said, it becomes in a way a defensive mechanism. In the Q&A, I think it'll be very good to come back to this particular aspect that Anand has raised. But for now, let me invite our second speaker, Archana Padmini, to add to the discussion so far. Archana?
Thank you, Lawrence. Hi, everyone. So I was actually thinking in terms of, or maybe as a spectator, as a viewer, as Lawrence was just putting it out, like infantilizing the viewers. I was thinking like the idea of censorship actually, it's kind of masking my vision as a spectator, and the state is telling me what to watch and how to watch and which propaganda you need to watch. So, and it's a time where you are, even the constitution is under threat, and it's a time where you are questioned for the reasons that are not really justified. So I personally, from my little understanding of the act and it's working, I understand that it's part of a bad policy making. First, in terms of the censor board, rather than it being a certification platform, it acting as a censoring platform seems difficult for me. I find it less democratic, and I would like to consider a kind of one of my experiential contexts, like while I was working in different film festivals, we were like given the instructions from INB Ministry to not show certain films. And I remember in 2017, IDSFK, International Documentary and Short Film Festival of Kerala, 3 films were banned. 3 films were not allowed to screen. So even without this intervention, new edition, new amendment of Cinematography Act 2021, there was this intervention from the government. There was this intervention from the state to not screen certain films. And I remember those films were, a film was from Kashmir, a film was on JNU protests. And I remember in Mumbai International Film Festival, MIF, a film was not screened because of certain technical reasons. So this process, I think it has started long back, and the interventions in film institutions. I remember filmmakers from the fraternity sharing their concerns about CBFC cuts, even like certain words were not allowed to use, uh, um, certain statements needed to be avoided. And I understand PSBT and such platforms are under crisis these days. So I would like to understand this imposition of this act in the context of all these events which were happening as part of a particular propaganda. And as a viewer, as a film practitioner, as an artist, I find it really dangerous. And the question is, who decides what is objectionable, uh, and who decides which films needs to be screened? And at some point, this may even lead to self-censorship, because the artist community, the film fraternity, the film industry, whatever it is, they have to survive. And I can see the future where there is this censorship happening inside the head of the filmmaker, so that they have to get these this they have to get this permission to screen the film. And at the end of the day, it becomes a particular film with a particular framework of certain ideological propaganda will survive and others will not. So I find it very dangerous, and I find it very, very much fascist in nature. And I think that is where my concern is, as a member of the community, as a member who, as a curator who actually interacts with a lot of filmmakers, and especially the independent filmmakers in India who are making documentaries, who are trying to have a dialogue, who are actually trying to have to express this, to have this democratic dissent, and the concerns Anand has raised. I think it's very, very dangerous in that context, and I don't find. I think it's a time where we should actually move away from censorship and liberate much more as a viewership community, and as a state we should evolve into that. And at that time, we are actually stepping back to a bad policy of censoring it again and blocking the narratives. So yeah, I'll stop it there and then I'll join after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Archana. Thanks particularly for raising the question of whether there are rights of spectators and how that could be configured into a debate like this. The question of the rights of spectators has in fact been kind of articulated on a number of occasions in various cases. Anand, for example, in various cases has challenged censorship, pushing the boundaries of the jurisprudence of free speech in India. Similarly, there is the Bobby Art International case, which is a Bandit Queen case, etc., all which have recognized spectatorial rights. And it's important to recognize and understand that what this amendment does is it also attempts in a way to create a legislative bypassing of judicial decisions. The Shankarappa case, by striking down Section 6 of the Cinematograph Act, was extremely clear, right? And this amendment basically bypasses the Supreme Court. Now, the one important question to ask is, can Parliament do that? Parliament has on a number of occasions, introduced laws to overcome the barriers set by judicial decisions. But the judicial decision in this case has invoked the holiest of holy doctrines, the basic structure doctrine and the separation of powers. In which case, can the Parliament actually do that? Let me turn now to our third speaker, because Sumana is not here. Vijay Krishna Acharya is a filmmaker from the Bombay film industry, and it'll be really important to get his understanding of how the industry is seeing these developments. Vijay?
Hi, Lawrence. Hi, Anand, Archana, Jenny, Lekha. Thanks for having me here. And first up, I think my interest in both the debate and on this panel is that of the film buff, and of course, as a practicing filmmaker or somebody who's, however, peripherally associated with the film industry. I work largely in the Hindi film industry in Mumbai, and so if I were to, I don't think, I think we are all pretty much in agreement here about what this amendment really speaks of. And if it speaks of this sort of extra superpower that the central government must have, or any government must have, over and above a monitoring board that is already in place, then it does speak of something which is very extrajudicial. Now, how we have come about to this, I think uh, those answers depend on reflection and not on debate. There is a certain, it's coming at the end of a certain kind of a curve. Whether we as people or as a populace, have we enabled it? Are we inevitably, do we like a little bit of a herding? I don't know. I would like to put that out there and see whether that has any resonance. So as a filmmaker or as a viewer, it it doesn't seem to augur well at all. Largely because the scrapping of any tribunal, which is, as a filmmaker, you expect to raise your voice, or you expect to be heard by other filmmakers, or at least by a body that you may have belief in, because films do follow creatively, and even in the way that we consume them, they follow a slightly different graph. It is often not as cut and dried as anything else that we consume. So the spectatorial rights, I think it's a great step up, and perhaps Lawrence can probably tell us how that can become some sort of an edifice on which we stand and argue for. Because when it comes to creative rights, we always seem to be in opposition to something. Um, so the scrapping of the tribunal, I know friends who and they are film friends who have been working in the mainstream industry, and their films have benefited because of the tribunal. Um, what seems counterintuitive to me is that if we were to look at purely the business aspect of it, and say, let me step away from the altar of creativity, ideology, or any of those words which are nuanced, purely as an industry, it is something which will hurt, because the fear then is, as a filmmaker or as a producer, because that's where it will hurt the most. Somebody has invested a certain kind of money, which is now dependent on some kind of a theatrical release for that money to be recovered. If there is a recall of that film, and the censor certificate, which also, as we have seen historically, does not count for too much these days, what do you do then? Whether the self-censorship that you apply, or is it a second guess at all times? Are we going to second guess every decision, every creative call? So those are the questions I think that everybody faces as a filmmaker, whichever side of the line you are at. But where it will definitely be detrimental is this industry, and knowing that the industry is offering a certain kind of employment and a certain kind of financial exchequer to the government, it seems counterintuitive even from that perspective. So I'm curious about what it is that impels this kind of a decision. It cannot be a judicial precedent, because both times that you've mentioned the cases, the courts have upheld the Cinematograph Act, but with a certain kind of caveat. And long as that is in play, I feel hopeful that we have still got some. We have skin in the game, but we also have some leverage, because judicially there is some sort of a precedent. Having said that, if you have to just step away and say the idea of censorship itself, and I'm very curious about that personally, because I think it's ambiguous, and I don't have a cogent answer that should it be there or should it not be there. Because if I look at it, then I look at the whole this whole wave of Iranian films which seem to have come about in decades, where the state is very clearly opposed to some things being shown. Uh, so is there an answer in a certain circumvention of rules? Is there an answer in a nuanced subversive culture? That is what we have to ask ourselves as filmmakers. Uh, because the message that you put across sometimes is direct and sometimes it's not. And when it's not, inevitably that's when it seems to stick really well, because people view films not just not just in very simple cut and dried ways, but it does resonate with you. So all those are things which perhaps, I mean, I would like to discuss or learn more about. But purely from a filmmaker working in the industry, where I can see that this is the biggest deterrent. It's the biggest stick in my hand, where I can rap you on the knuckles and say, you know what, you can't show your film because we don't think it's right. And that is not, it's not this or that. It's just not good policy, and it should not be the power of any government. It has, if there's a film certification board about which itself we are constantly divided, and we have been arguing for a rating system by which a certain kind of consumption, if you want to rate it according to age, that's fine, that's fair. But this sense of a certificate and this word will get beeped and that will, those are, in this day and age, they are really, they're strange things to encounter. Um, so yeah, so that would be my point, Lawrence, really, which is not uh, the fact that this should be opposed. I think that's not uh, that's a given. It's in how is it that you navigate this, and how is it, and why does it come about, and can we do things which will at least, um, as film people or as people in the arts, you will have to be in conflict with larger a lot of mainstream society. We will be in conflict with figures of authority, and that also is a given. So I assume that uh, it's the dialogue that one needs to have, and also to understand how is it that we can legally or otherwise circumvent this. That perhaps would be my thing. Otherwise, I'm um, happy to hear more from others.
Thanks, Vijay. I'll take my prerogative as the moderator and just pose a couple of questions, and then open it to the audience. There is something that the three of you have said in which there is a clear overlap that I see, right? And I want to split this into two. The first one is, when Vijay asked the question of, what are the ways in which one can navigate, and how do we actually understand this? So there is the dimension in the sense of, following from the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges, who said that censorship is the mother of metaphor. Two examples that I want to give you. One is, um, in the, I think, 1970s or the 1980s, when Satyadev Dubey was kind of, performing Gidh He was, and with the Dramatic Performances Act, you have to submit your script. And there is a moment in the film where the father-in-law kind of beats, his daughter-in-law, and she suffers, and she kind of has a miscarriage. And that's represented, with this kind of red-stained sari. The censors in that case, the police said that you cannot show a red stain, right? You're not allowed to show it. So Satyadev Dubey accepted, the limitation set by the police. But before the play started, he came and made an announcement in which he says, at this particular point in the play, you're going to have a woman who's going to come there with a completely unstained sari, and she's going to scream, and you have to imagine that her sari is red stained, right? In a similar manner, since Vijay mentioned the Iranian filmmakers, there's a fantastic film by Jafar Panahi, which is called This Is Not a Film, where the filmmaker basically imagines within the confines of his apartment the film that he wants to make, but is not being allowed to make, right? So my first question is this. My first question is that, are we focusing too much on fighting the legal battle and not focusing as much as one ought to on all the other battles? Or is the legal battle really kind of the precondition to even fighting some of the other battles? And I want to pose this to you as kind of, filmmakers. The second question that I had for the panel was really to do with, again, something that Anand has repeatedly kind of said. One of the justifications, and I see that there's a question which actually asks about what is the reasoning and what is the motivation behind this particular amendment. One of the arguments or justifications by the government is that the Shankarappa judgment in the Supreme Court effectively leaves us without any measure or any kind of response which is possible in the event that a film has been granted a censor certificate, but subsequent upon release, it creates law and order problems, right? And we don't have any way of kind of, curbing or recalling these kinds of films. So one question that arises for me is that if institutions are subject to political capture, and we've seen this, of course, repeatedly over the last, kind of 6 and 7 years or so, is there any merit in the argument that if institutions are subject to political capture and therefore censor boards are very happy to, for example, give censor certificates even for films which could be considered, to be hateful or fall foul of hate speech laws, and then you have no subsequent mechanism, is that a valid concern? Or are some of these concerns addressed enough by, let's say, traditional provisions in the Indian Penal Code? Or is there any argument that can be made at all about this? So I'll hand this over to the panel. Anand, do you want to begin? And then we'll have Archana and Vijay responding, and then we can open it out to the audience.
So basically, the legal path is something that we'll have to follow if they go through with this amendment. And I hope that the film industry at large, some people will stand up to be counted. I'm not absolutely sure about that because there's a lot of money involved in making films, at least the commercial films, the Bollywood films. But we need some people from Bollywood to stand up as well. It can't be just documentary filmmakers who are not part of the financial game as such. But on the other hand, I think that the only effective way of fighting this is to vote this government out of power. Because with this government in power right now, every institution is being compromised. And it's no surprise at all that they are looking at the audiovisual medium and the media. So whether it's films or whether they're going to do this to OTT platforms as well, they're going to basically try and stifle every kind of dissent. And we see them doing it systematically. So I think that the larger picture is that we have to mobilize a movement. I mean, we should be part of a movement that will change the government. But as that is not going to happen anytime soon, we have to do everything else. And I think the legal action that we can do is on healthy grounds because there's enough precedence in the courts against what they're trying to do. I mean, before I ever went to court, there were already judgments that were spectacular in defending the freedom of expression as well as the public's right to information. So these are the two planks on which I fought all my cases, court cases, and we've won. So I think that I think we will win again as long as the courts are not compromised. But we know that courts are compromised these days in many cases. So let's see where that goes.
Archana?
I think I completely agree with Anand. And I was thinking, like Anand was telling about him going to court, and it's a constant struggle in a filmmaker's life. And I was thinking in a different way. Do we really think all the filmmakers are like they can do this? So I really think there should be a change in the policy, because this constant battle at some point can actually be very tiresome. So it can also block the creative energy within the filmmakers and the community. So I really don't think it's not a very simple. We don't have one solution, because it's there is this not so legal part of it, the propaganda that is growing around us on what narrative should be seen and propagated, and which is the right narrative, and the content and its purity, and we are in a very complex situation and complex discourse on regarding the narratives and the production of narratives. So I don't think it's very easy to find a solution, but definitely we as part of the community, as part of the film fraternity, will have to move in different ways. The strategy must be very layered. One definitely trying to engage with the system, and it is always tiring, being a woman who have been always trying to negotiate with the system, trying to talk to the court. We have that experience in hand. So, but then we do that again and again. So it's a process, long, very, very tiring process. And for a creative individual and a filmmaker, it's very unfortunate that they have to go through all these things again and again. But definitely there's hope that artists can somehow, go beyond it. At the same time, apart from the policy, I think there should be this movement. There should be people talking about this. There should be we should be mobilizing people. We should have discussions over this, and definitely, I think I don't think there is a space in a country where the constitution itself is getting changed. How do we negotiate with this system is very, very problematic. So there is hope. There is constant struggle. So yeah, I don't know how to go with. I mean, I don't have a solution, and I'm actually trying to listen to everybody. Yeah. Thank you.
Vijay?
So, Lawrence, I mean, if you just look at this act and what was struck down and what has been brought in, those are judicial things. There was a judicial power which struck something down because it was unconstitutional. Now, if it has been brought in through some manner, and at this point, even if we were to give the benefit of oversight or something, I'm saying sometimes it just helps me to look at everything as benign and really wonderful. and everybody acting out of their best interests. So it's an act. It has been brought in kind of some kind of contravention to an established judicial an established judgment. Then we have to challenge it in that space. Then there is, of course, the resultant creative space of, if it is not this, there will be something else. If not today, there will be something else tomorrow. That's a larger thing for the creative community, which rarely speaks in one voice in that sense. So and that's fine too, because uh, you need the multi voices. Everybody needn't agree all the time. So to answer your question, the judicial process is important. I mean, when the act came about, a whole lot of us wrote to the ministry. We've signed a document which pretty clearly puts forth the views about which everybody agrees, that the appellate tribunal should be there, that this act, even in terms of piracy, is it's a little bit of an overkill. Certain sections of the IPC are already in play for piracy, and the way to limit piracy perhaps is different. The act of revoking a certificate, or of having control over something, that is a gross extension of power. And about that, there cannot be a negotiation. What perhaps can be in place is a discussion on how to address the concerns which any government might have. But that calls for engagement and interaction. And I'm not sure how much of that is happening. And I'm also not sure when uh, film industries across the globe, every big studio, they're notorious for being really myopic. And and that is why I find the act and this revoking power counterintuitive, because if tomorrow everybody were to wait to see what happens to this act and not make films and not let it come on, somebody has to just crunch the numbers and say, actually, this is going to be these many thousand crores of a problem. So again, it seems as if it's another step which is probably not very well thought out. Whether it's in the larger scheme of things, well, I think everybody here is bright enough to understand where or how that might be coming from. But the spaces to challenge it would be some amount of discourse. Right now, the industry, at least a fair number of people uh, from Mumbai, from Chennai, have lent their names to this letter. But if it is a court thing, then we have to fight it in the court, and then we have to see what are the other spaces where this can get where you combat something like this. But the larger question is, we will different governments will bring different acts, and there has uh, as an artist, whether you are mainstream, whether you are off mainstream, whether you are completely guerrilla or counterculture, you end up here because you have some trouble with an established sense of either society or an established sense of authority. Why would you think better for me than me is a fundamental question uh, which I think anybody on this panel would have struggled with in their teenage years, and that's why we've ended up wherever we have ended up. So those kind of questions are central to us. Whether we come in with the legislation, and perhaps you can help us to understand actually what really are the rights and what is the correct way to take this ahead legally, because it's clear that it needs to be spoken of in all those terms, with an industry's united voice legally, and what is perhaps the greatest and the loudest voice of all, which is the public.
Thanks, Vijay. I will come in on this a little later, perhaps. Um, Suffice it to say for now that we actually don't even have enough information. the letter inviting responses to the proposed amendments were not even by way of a draft bill. They just literally enumerated the amendments that they were thinking of. So I think that it's still a little early right now to see what the shape of the final proposed amendment will be. And it's at that stage that one will have to think of very particular legal kind of responses. But let me now open it out to the audience. I think if I can ask the panelists to look at the Q&A, open your Q&A tab and take on any question that is of interest to you. Some of them are particularly directed. For example, some are directed to Anand, but otherwise feel free to enter in on any of them. Anand, can you see the question and answer
No,
tab?
actually,
There's one
I
that's
can't.
specifically for you.
I can't see them. If you can just read it out.
I can read it out for you. Srinivasa
Yeah.
Murthy asks, filmmakers like Mr. Patwardhan have had problems earlier in the last 7 years, including the last 7 years. What is the difference in the challenges of the last 7 years as compared to the earlier periods? He's asking for you to focus on larger systemic issues in society and governments, in addition to the issues of the present government.
Okay, but I would like to say that there is a huge difference between the present government and any previous government, including their own previous government. So even when the BJP was in power the last time, we were successful in fighting, for instance, for the film War and Peace, which was an anti-nuclear film, and we managed to get a censor certificate. And I also managed to force them to show it on Doordarshan. So there were two separate matters. So with the previous avatar of the BJP, things had not crystallized to the extent that they have now. I'm sorry to be openly political about this, but I don't see how I can avoid talking about the major shift in what has happened in the last 7 years. Because I think right now what we're talking about is to give Goebbels the power of censorship. It's nothing short of that. So that I'm not willing to do, and we'll fight it in every way we can. We'll fight it legally, we'll fight it on the streets, we'll fight it in whatever way we are able to do that. So it's okay to talk about the overall concept of censorship and why that's bad. I agree with all of that. But when we get down to the particulars, we want to know that the people who assign themselves the ethical right to sit in judgment over any work of art, what are their credentials? I mean, the example that I always give is that in War and Peace, they didn't want me to say that Nathuram Godse killed Mahatma Gandhi. So if you have a government that is trying to rewrite history, you're going to run into problems at every step. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Anand, there's one more which perhaps you might want to take on.
Yeah.
This is a question by Simon Verghese, which says that how can we have a censorship-free society when the nation is so deeply religious? And what's the way forward, especially in the time of OTT platforms?
Yeah, I mean, look at the example of what they tried to do. They couldn't even tolerate Meera Nair's Suitable Boy because there has a love sequence between a Hindu and a Muslim. So if what they are doing is basically subverting the Constitution, and the Censorship Act, the Cinematograph Act, after all, derives power from the Constitution of India. And if you have a government in power that is actually hell-bent on completely they don't even have to rewrite the Constitution, they just have to ignore it completely and reinvent it. So that's the process we're in. And yes, when you have so many different religions and so many different people who might take offense at any kind of thing, and of course it's not just religion, it's also the sexuality. I mean, the fact that normative sexuality is the only one they recognize, and so everything else is taboo for them. and they will start objecting about everything. So I think we have to stand our ground and say, no, the world has changed and we are changing with the world.
Thanks, Anand. There are a couple of other questions which are, in a way, kind of on the overlap between the industry and transformations in the industry, particularly brought about by OTT platforms. So, Vijay, can I ask you to take those on? Are you able to see them, or would you like us to read out the questions to you?
No, I can see them. I can see them. The first one that I see is with the deep pockets of the OTT promoters, do you believe filmmakers on this platform will be largely free from this regressive curtailing or and get to threaten or throttle? So, so yes, I think that that question has been answered some time ago. There is with the kind of popular protest, nobody with any kind of commercial or financial interest in showing something. Okay, in simple terms, I want to show you something, and based on that, I have invested in this piece of work. If I'm not able to show it to you, there is no way that this money is ever going to come back to me. And if you stop it, then not only do I lose money, but I also lose, you know, reputation, face, whatever. So I think the OTT platforms have already seen that, and I think they have gone into whatever is the first first defense of any corporate oblique commercial body, which is that they will protect their financial interests. And though we may balk at it and we may find it completely uh, not right or something, they are doing what they must do because they are essentially a body which is out there and it costs money and they are going to protect the commercial interest. So the whether they have deep pockets or not, there is no platform that can afford uh, to be enemies with the government in any country. So that I don't think that will really work out. The the question is whether filmmakers will be able to circumvent. I think so. I think authors, writers, poets, filmmakers have always done it. So it's time to step up. That's all I would say. Sorry, there's one more. How have other countries with a sizable investment in this industry? Do we have a template we can suggest to the government? So this, I think, this kind of a thing definitely speaks of whether it was the Mudgal committee or the Sham Benegal committee, the suggestions to the government about certifying. Uh, I would assume that film certification or consumption for a country which is as large as ours and with a sizable young population and the consumption of content is increasing fairly exponentially. It is in the interest of all parties to have a certain set of rules, but the set of rules cannot be in opposition to creative freedom. At the same time, that creative freedom also is perhaps defined along the lines of what Lawrence you mentioned about hate speech and things. So, because on the one hand, if there is a clampdown on something which seems radical, there must also be a clampdown on things which are akin to hate speech. And I find that in the public space there is a fair amount of that happening. So what happens when we are looking at censorship? And like I said earlier, where is that reflection? Are we censoring ourselves in the public space but not in the private? And do we then expect a certain kind of uniform public code, whereas the limits to what we might express outside of the film theater is a free for all? So that kind of an engagement whether it's with the government or with anybody who's in power and has the power to make rules, is perhaps needed. Um, the other sizable industries that I can think of, well, I mean, Hollywood is one. France has a pretty thriving film industry, and they are protectionist in their own way, but they've managed to keep it going. So there is a. I don't think anybody follows a film certification route the way we do. Um, or let me rephrase that: the way we do in liberal democratic societies. Uh, so the notion itself has to keep getting evaluated year on year, just the way that the terms of public discourse or even private discourse have evolved over the years. There is a certain kind of crass joke. There is a certain kind of how should I put it, objectification that is no longer currency, that is no longer welcome. It might be a small populace, it might be a small audience which is giving you the feedback and saying, we don't want this. But then you have to take it and you do a certain kind of course correction. So if there is engagement, then that course correction has to happen. And as you said, right now, this is only at the stage of asking for people to opine. Well, a bunch of us have opined, as is this platform trying to garner some sort of support and opinion that this would not be the right way to go for anybody, neither the filmmakers, nor the film viewers, nor the film buffs, and nor the people who are working in this industry. And it's actually detrimental for all of that.
I want to respond to one of the questions that Suparna has raised, which is freedom of expression with reasonable restrictions is the starting point. No denying that this will lead to self-censorship. But the law and order argument is also very strong in the hands of the state. There are two things I just want to say on this, which is, I want to pick up on your phrase, the starting point. You're absolutely right. I mean, Article 19(1)(a), which is, freedom of speech and expression, is followed immediately by Article 19(2), which are about reasonable restrictions. And they, 19(1)(a) and 19(2) together should be the starting point. What's the problem with this particular amendment? There are two things. One is that it actually confuses what the start point and what the end point is. And how does it do that? I would like to suggest that the amendment basically introduces what one could describe as a process of evergreening in the domain of censorship. What's the process of evergreening? Evergreening in the law is that if you take, for example, let's say a patent that is granted on a medicine, it's a patent that's granted for a limited amount of time, 20 years. At the end of the 20 years, the patent on the drug comes to an end and the drug comes into the public domain. But pharmaceutical companies are experts at kind of, resubmitting the same patent with a few modifications such that there is a constant evergreening of the patent. If one had to borrow that concept and look at the idea of the evergreening of censorship, it broadly comes down to this. The Cinematograph Act is already a creature of Article 19(2). It's been found to be reasonable within Article 19(2) for certain reasons. But the exercise of its power, therefore, is circumscribed by the rules that have been laid out, by the institutional norms that have been incorporated into the Act, and by the kind of responsibilities assigned to players defined under the Act. One of the clear things there was that there was an entire recognition, as Vijay rightly said, that a recognition in a way of a jury of your peers, of filmmakers, and not of bureaucrats, which is what the appellate tribunal, etc., was about. The power that exists in the form of the revisionary power of the government and the power to recall censor certificates is effectively the grant of an evergreening power in the domain of censorship. So that's where, where do you start and where do you end? It gets entirely confused. Is the starting point Article 19(1)(a) and 19(2), or is it some kind of a form of potential censorship in perpetuity? Second point that I want to make on this is that again, effectively what it allows for, this power of recall, is acceding to the sovereignty of the heckler, right? So if you try to understand that Article 19(1)(a) is very clear, and Article 19(2) in terms of the restrictions are, let's say, in the interest of public order, decency, morality, etc. There is a nexus that is sought between an utterance, a text, a film, and the actual violence that will erupt, right? And the courts have made a distinction, a fine distinction between opinions, advocacy, and incitement. And the courts have been clear that it's not until you reach the point of incitement, where there is a clear relationship between speech act and violence, that the law, kind of comes in, or you fall foul of the law. The problem here is that it's not so much about the actual violence that can be incited by, let's say, a film, as much as the anticipated violence, which often is never about violence, but about offense taking. So if a large enough number of people claim that their sentiments have been hurt, or that there is an anticipation in terms of a threat to, let's say, burn a cinema theater down, etc., the government in this instance is going to use its revolutionary powers to step in. And there is a serious kind of problem with that, because that is, in a way, an abdication of the role of what a sovereign state is about, the role of what a government should be doing, and in a way kind of acceding to the jurisdiction of the heckler. And therein, the combination of these two problems creates a really kind of dangerous situation as far as this kind of proposed amendment is concerned. Yeah. Archana, do you want to come in on any of the questions that have been raised?
I'll just add randomly to whatever everybody was saying. I think the medium that we have as artists and filmmakers is a kind of we have most. I mean, it has more strength in that sense. Somebody was mentioning Iranian films, the way they were trying to, you know, engage with the system, the state, and the censorship. So I wish more such films happen. I mean, apart from the movement and a political movement on the street, apart from the negotiation with the court and policymakers, I expect better films with, which are actually engaging with this idea of censorship. Questioning it will actually happen at this time. When actually because the artists rights to exercise or practice their work is actually curtailed. So in that sense, I wish such films happen. And somebody was actually talking about OTTs, and I think we know even the social media handles that we are handling are actually being censored by the ministry. So we will have to actually we should be able to go on and negotiate everywhere. So it's a constant fight and process that we are in. I mean, we have to go through this, I think. Yeah, that's all.
I have a question to both the filmmakers as well as anyone in the audience who might be interested in stepping into this. At some point of time, Vijay had asked the question of how did we come to this, and were we in a way kind of partially responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in? And the question I want to pose to filmmakers is this: on the one hand, the romance of being a filmmaker is premised on the absolute belief in the power of the image. Right? I mean, you have to believe that and genuinely love the image to the point that you believe that there is nothing in the history of communication that still comes as close to this magical intersection between sound, color, image, and voice, right? And that's the power of the magic of film. At the same time, do you think the romance has been carried a little too far, right? Isn't the entire justification of censorship, and here I have in mind the K.A. Abbas case. The K.A. Abbas judgment takes the romance of the filmmaker and takes it to a legal height and says, yes, yes, we absolutely agree with you. It's because your power is so your medium is so powerful, because there is nothing like the image, that we need to justify a separate mechanism altogether when it comes to the censorship of films. Have we reached a point in the 21st century where we are, in a way, in a very different state of media literacy? Children encounter smartphones from the age of 4 or 3 or 4. Children are bombarded in a way by images in a way that it's not the naivety of the spectator running when the approaching train, set forth by the Lumiere brothers, scared them out, right? So in that sense, the media literacy of today is very, very different. Should filmmakers be taking a slightly different, kind of an angle? And it's a paradox. How do you continue in a way to believe in the magic of cinema while at the same time arguing that cinema should not be treated differently from other media when it comes to censorship? Yeah.
So, Lawrence, the truth is, you're absolutely right when it comes to a question of media literacy, and it's exponential. There is a certain it's exponential both in its creativity and in its consumption. So there is the power of the image uh, is is multifarious now. It's not relegated only to the theater. In fact, if anything else, the power of the image or of the visual communication or the audio visual communication has liberated itself from the auspices of theatrical or OTT or television programs. It's actually it's here. It's on your phone. And in some strange way, it also gives you the freedom to choose what you want to see, how you want to see it, what you want to do with it. Uh, I think the freakiest and the most enjoyable of all of these arts is the meme, which is the dissonance between the image and what it actually portrays, and in the copy that you put on it, and the irony of it is actually what's funny, and it's fantastic. I think it's great. So there is yes, it comes from the image, and so much of it owes to films, because films are so strongly in our DNAs that their cross-referencing and their parody is also a strong um, sort of statement to make. So, is the romance of the image dead? Well, I hope not for some time, but I think it's the sheen is off. It's no longer the glossy. How should I put it? You know, it's not all powerful, and I think in its vulnerability is its beauty, is its power, and that allows us to look at it differently. uh, I think people like to hear stories. That is that is pretty much the reason why I think uh, why I like to see films. And at the end of the day, it's something that tells us about ourselves, and not in a way which is dogmatic, or not in a way which is large, but actually what you come about is an experience which is perhaps shared, which is as human as you. So those are I mean, that's content. That's what drives me to the movies. That's what I'd like to do. But the romance and the set of rules that seem to dictate how much of this romance can you see and what can you see in this romance, that is a huge conflict, and that uh, I'm hopeful that we will be able to creatively challenge it, but I feel that we'll have to challenge it year on year and time after time. I mean, India has also had an incident of a film which was made, and the negative of the film, and the film was viewed and was burnt, and because it was not found conducive to be viewed. by the public, because, and it was a satire. It was not even as if it was something which was, critical, openly critical, or anything else. So we have
Are you referring to Kissa Kursi?
Kitsa Kursi Ka, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And on the same front, what I remember, I mean, back from post emergency, IS Johar made a film called Nasbandi, and which was, I don't know whether it's on YouTube, but I remember seeing the film, and the film had the lookalikes or some sort of a double of every big star of the time. There were people who were named, because it was part satire, part a sort of criticism of what was happening um, during the emergency with the whole vasectomy and all the rest of it. So there was a voice which came, however, in whichever way it was possible for the filmmaker, who was also a satirist, a great humorist, and he put it out there. So I feel that engagement happens, but that's essentially an individual engagement. And that's the curious thing about films. It is individual expression for community viewing, at the end of which the community should be within their rights to make their minds up about something, rather than uh, rather than anybody else who can say, oh, this is not fit for you. And we are no longer infants globally. And I find that also curious, that on the one hand we are so sort of uh, publicly so strong about how so many good things are Indian, and how we are really pushing forth uh, different boundaries all over the world. Then I'm certain that we should be uh, we should be bright enough to be able to monitor what is it that we are watching.
Uh, I've actually pasted a link to the full film, Kissa Kursi Ka, which is now on YouTube. As with much else in the world, YouTube is both the greatest savior and the greatest bane of our lives. For the longest time, Kissa Kursi Ka was that mythical film which one only spoke about because all the we believed that all the reels had been burnt, and it was the shining torch of the tyranny of censorship. Where you never saw the film and no one saw the film because it had been burnt. Now, thankfully, YouTube has rescued and has put the entire film online. But unfortunately, like much else with early romances, once you watch it, you're wondering why you bothered. So yeah, but there's the film there. Uh, any questions to our panelists directly about the statements or the arguments that they have made, or any questions, information seeking questions in terms of the nature of the proposed amendment? There is a question which says, any establishment dislikes dissent, or should the social movement focus on the larger issue of freedom of expression? I believe that this is more or less covered in many aspects, I think, of what people have said.
Avijit Kishore makes a statement, an observation about the burning of the reels uh, anti-emergency films.
Yeah, no, just thanks to all the panelists. Um, from my side, I mean, anyone wants more information on the amendment, I'm happy to share links on email, both to comments on the proposed amendments as well as to prior cases. Yeah.
It's very nice to be here. It's just disconcerting sometimes we just talk to a screen. That's all. But yeah, I think, well, um, yeah, too many thoughts about censorship and this, and I think a step at a time, as Lawrence said. And I'll share. I suppose you probably saw the letter that was put out from the film fraternity, pretty much, Lawrence. Uh, Going ahead, one should just see how it transpires, what happens, what's the next step. Do we hear anything back from from the government? Do we not? On all other fronts, questions like should we be engaging and what is the route forward? I think there are people more who've thought about that a great deal. I guess individually everybody has to do their bit in whichever way they can, without being sanctimonious or sort of unnecessarily how should I put it, dangerous at the moment. So thank you all for having me here, and thank you for all the wonderful people who clocked in and heard us, at least me, ramble on and on. It's always lovely to hear Lawrence, and thank you, Lekha, Archana. Bye bye.
As a follower of cinema and looking at it as an elevated reflection of the lives we live or at least aspire to, it has been an important exercise in understanding what goes on behind the curtain before the projector is turned on. One of the things that arose in many conversations amongst spectators, filmmakers, audiences was the lack of information and understanding as far as the act and the amendments were concerned, and a frankly alarming dismissal of the presence of a problem at all in some certain cases. We hope this session has provided some clarity to those looking for it, more questions to ponder for those who contemplate, and some context for the ignorant. Thank you so much, Anand, Archana, Vijay, for taking the time, being on this panel and being so refreshingly honest and open and sharing your love for the medium with us. Thank you, Lawrence, for being as stellar and sparkling with your clarity as always. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you and good night and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.